The secure telephone connection from Naples crackled to life in the early morning hours of September 9, 1943, carrying Field Marshal Albert Kesselring's voice across the static, with news that German commanders throughout southern Europe had been expecting yet hoping would not materialize. American and British forces were landing in force at Salerno, establishing a beachhead on the Italian mainland, barely hours after Italy's armistice with the Allies had been announced to a shocked world. For the German generals receiving these reports, men like Kesselring, who commanded in the Mediterranean, Heinrich von Vietinghoff, directing the 10th Army, and the planners at OKW in Berlin, this moment represented the convergence of political catastrophe and military crisis that would fundamentally reshape Germany's strategic position in southern Europe and force the Wehrmacht into a defensive campaign on Italian soil that would consume forces desperately needed elsewhere for the remainder of the war. The Italian armistice itself, announced just hours before the Salerno landings, had not surprised German leadership, despite Hitler's public expressions of shock and betrayal. Wehrmacht intelligence had been tracking Italian negotiations with the Allies for weeks, had observed the political maneuvering in Rome following Mussolini's deposition in July, had noted the movement of Italian naval units and the behavior of Italian commanders that suggested preparation for defection. Operation Axis, the German plan for occupying Italy and disarming Italian forces in the event of armistice, had been prepared in detail and was already being implemented when news of the armistice broke. German troops were moving to secure key positions throughout northern and central Italy, were confronting Italian units with demands to surrender their weapons, were converting what had been an alliance into military occupation. But the Salerno landings added a new and more immediate crisis to the political disaster of Italian defection. American forces of the Fifth Army under General Mark Clark were coming ashore south of Naples, threatening to establish a major Allied presence on the Italian mainland that would turn the peninsula into an active theater of ground combat. The landings were not unexpected. German intelligence had identified Salerno as a likely invasion site, and Kesselring had positioned German forces to respond. But knowing where the Americans would land was different from being able to prevent them from establishing a beachhead, and the reports arriving at German headquarters documented the now familiar pattern of overwhelming Allied material superiority being systematically applied to overwhelm German defensive positions. General Heinrich von Vietinghoff, commanding the German 10th Army responsible for southern Italy's defense, received the initial reports from coastal observation posts as the invasion fleet appeared off Salerno's beaches in the pre-dawn darkness. The scale was immense. Hundreds of vessels offshore, naval guns beginning bombardment of German positions, aircraft circling overhead, ready to provide close support to landing forces. The German defenders, primarily the 16th Panzer Division, positioned to respond to invasion attempts, prepared to contest the landings, while Vietinghoff assessed whether this was the main Allied effort or a diversion preceding larger operations elsewhere. The initial American and British assault waves came ashore against varying resistance. At some points, German defensive fire was devastating, pinning down landing forces on beaches and inflicting casualties that created chaos in the assault waves. At others, Allied troops established footholds with surprising ease, pushing inland before German forces could concentrate their response. The inconsistency reflected the reality of amphibious warfare against prepared defenses. Heavily fortified points could exact terrible tolls, but no defensive line could be equally strong everywhere, and Allied forces were skilled at identifying and exploiting weak points. Kesselring, receiving these reports at his headquarters, understood immediately that Salerno represented both opportunity and danger for German forces in Italy. The opportunity was that Allied forces were coming ashore at a single, identifiable point where German divisions could concentrate for counterattack. Unlike the situation in Sicily, where multiple landing sites had dispersed Axis response, or the potential nightmare scenario of simultaneous invasions at multiple points on Italy's long coastline, the Americans had committed to Salerno. If German forces could mass sufficient strength quickly enough, they might crush the beachhead while Allied forces were still organizing, drive them back into the sea, inflict casualties that would make the Allies reconsider their Italian strategy. The danger was that this same concentration of Allied forces represented overwhelming combat power that, once fully established ashore, would be nearly impossible to dislodge. The Allied air and naval superiority that had characterized operations in Sicily was even more pronounced at Salerno. German aircraft venturing over the invasion zone were shot down with regularity, while Allied fighter bombers and naval guns could strike German positions with devastating effectiveness. German forces attempting to counterattack would have to advance under this aerial and naval bombardment, would take casualties before even reaching Allied ground forces, would be fighting an enemy that could call on practically unlimited fire support. Kesselring's decision to attempt crushing the beachhead rather than conducting immediate withdrawal to more defensible positions farther north reflected both his assessment of military possibilities and his understanding of political imperatives. Militarily, allowing the Allies to establish themselves at Salerno uncontested meant ceding most of southern Italy, including Naples with its port facilities, and accepting that Allied forces would have secure lodgment from which to advance northward. Politically, Hitler demanded that German forces defend Italian territory aggressively, that they demonstrate Germany's commitment to holding what had been Axis land, that they make the Allies pay maximum price for every kilometer gained. Abandoning Salerno without serious fight would violate these directives and expose Kesselring to accusations of defeatism. Over the next several days, German forces launched a series of increasingly desperate counterattacks against the Salerno beachhead. The 16th Panzer Division, reinforced by elements of other divisions, rushed to the area, attacked American positions with characteristic Wehrmacht tactical skill. German tanks and infantry coordinated assaults that achieved local successes, pushing back American units at several points, creating moments when it appeared the beachhead might be split and the two Allied landing forces separated from each other. These tactical achievements, documented in after-action reports that German commanders studied carefully, revealed both Wehrmacht strengths and the fundamental limitations of what even excellent tactics could accomplish against overwhelming material superiority. German units fighting at Salerno demonstrated the combined arms proficiency, the small unit leadership, the aggressive mindset that had characterized successful Wehrmacht operations throughout the war. They inflicted significant casualties on American forces, particularly in the initial days when some U.S. units were still finding their footing on hostile shores. But every German success was temporary. Every penetration eventually contained, every local victory neutralized by Allied ability to bring overwhelming firepower to threatened sectors. When German armor concentrated for attack, Allied naval guns, battleships and cruisers firing from offshore, delivered devastating barrages that destroyed tanks and disrupted formations before they reached their objectives. When German infantry pressed forward, Allied aircraft appeared overhead within minutes, bombing and strafing with accuracy that made daylight movement suicidal. When German forces achieved breakthroughs, Allied reserves arrived with a speed that reflected superior logistics and motorization, plugging gaps before exploitation could succeed. General von Vietinghoff, coordinating these counterattacks from 10th Army headquarters, understood by September 13th that the Salerno beachhead could not be eliminated. His forces had fought skillfully, had achieved everything that tactical competence could accomplish, but had failed to overcome the systemic advantages Allied forces possessed. The beachhead was expanding rather than contracting. American forces were bringing more troops and equipment ashore continuously, and Allied fire support was making German defensive positions untenable. Continuing to attack would only bleed away German divisions that would be needed for the defensive campaign that was now inevitable. Kesselring's authorization for withdrawal from Salerno came reluctantly, not because he believed continued attack could succeed, but because admitting failure meant acknowledging broader strategic realities that Hitler resisted accepting. German forces began pulling back from the immediate beachhead area, establishing new defensive lines farther north, preparing to contest the Allied advance through the mountainous terrain of southern Italy, where German defensive advantages might partially offset Allied material superiority. The pattern that would define the Italian campaign for the next 18 months was already visible in the Salerno battle's aftermath. German forces would fight defensive battles with tactical skill, would make Allies pay heavily for territorial gains, would conduct fighting withdrawals to successive defensive lines in terrain that favored defense. Allied forces would advance systematically, would apply overwhelming artillery and air power to reduce German positions, would eventually push German forces back through sheer weight of material. Neither side would achieve decisive operational victory. Germans could not drive Allies from Italy. Allies could not destroy German forces or advance rapidly northward. The result would be grinding attrition that consumed forces on both sides while serving neither's broader strategic objectives particularly well. For the German generals absorbing the implications of American landings in Italy, the strategic situation was more troubling than the immediate tactical concerns at Salerno. Italy's armistice had created a military occupation scenario across the entire peninsula and in Italian-occupied territories from southern France through the Balkans to the Aegean Islands. German forces were simultaneously fighting Allied invasion at Salerno, disarming Italian units throughout their reach, securing key industrial and transportation infrastructure in northern Italy, and dealing with the sudden disappearance of Italian garrison forces that had occupied vast territories now requiring German troops to control. The arithmetic was brutal and inescapable. Each German division committed to defending Italy was a division unavailable for the Eastern Front, where Soviet forces were launching offensives that were steadily pushing the Wehrmacht back toward pre-war borders. Each battalion assigned to garrison duties in Italy or the Balkans was a battalion that could not reinforce the forces preparing to defend France against the inevitable Allied invasion from England. The Italian theatre was consuming German military resources in a defensive campaign that could not be won, only prolonged, while other theatres faced crises that threatened Germany's ability to continue the war at all. General Alfred Jodl, Chief of Operations at OKW, presented Hitler with assessments that attempted to convey these strategic realities without triggering the Führer's rage at what he interpreted as defeatism. Jodl's memoranda noted that defending Italy would require substantial German forces, that the terrain favored defense and would allow relatively few divisions to slow Allied advance significantly, but that this defensive success would come at the cost of tying down forces desperately needed elsewhere. The Italian campaign would become a strategic dead end, German forces defending territory that had no particular strategic value, while Allies invested resources in an advance that was not directed toward any decisive objective. But Hitler's response to these analyses revealed that political and psychological factors outweighed purely military logic in his strategic thinking. Abandoning Italy would mean surrendering territory, appearing weak to Germany's remaining allies, providing allies with unchallenged access to Mediterranean bases from which to bomb southern Germany and the Romanian oil fields. More fundamentally, Hitler could not accept that territory once conquered should be voluntarily surrendered without maximum resistance. His entire strategic approach was predicated on holding ground, on making enemies pay for every meter, on refusing to acknowledge that retreat might sometimes serve strategic purposes, better than stubborn defense of tactically or operationally meaningless terrain. The decision to defend Italy in depth, to commit substantial forces to a campaign that would last until Germany's final collapse, reflected these priorities. Kesselring was given forces and authority to establish defensive lines across the Italian peninsula, the first being the Winter Line south of Rome, later the Gothic Line farther north, that would be defended with the same determination that characterized German defensive operations elsewhere. These positions would be fortified, would exploit Italy's mountainous terrain, would be held by troops who understood that unauthorized withdrawal meant courts-martial and execution. For German commanders tasked with implementing this strategy, the Italian campaign presented unique challenges and frustrations. The terrain was difficult, but offered excellent defensive positions. The Allied advance was methodical and could be slowed through competent defense, but the entire strategic purpose of the campaign was questionable. What was being accomplished by defending Italy beyond consuming resources on both sides and delaying an Allied advance toward objectives that were not themselves decisive? General Heinrich von Vietinghoff, whose 10th Army would bear primary responsibility for conducting the defensive campaign, understood that he was being asked to fight a battle that could not be won for objectives that did not matter strategically. The best outcome he could hope for was to delay Allied advance while preserving his forces, to conduct the kind of mobile defense that exacted maximum Allied casualties while avoiding the destruction of German divisions in hopeless last stands. But this approach contradicted Hitler's no-retreat philosophy, creating a constant tension between military professionalism and political imperatives. The broader implications of American landings in Italy extended beyond the immediate theater. The success at Salerno, following the Sicily campaign's success, demonstrated that Allied amphibious capabilities were now mature and reliable. The Anglo-American alliance could conduct opposed landings against prepared defenses, could sustain forces across beaches until ports were captured, could coordinate naval, air, and ground forces with professional competence. This capability, proven in the Mediterranean, would be applied to northwestern Europe in less than a year, when the Normandy invasion would establish Allied forces in France, with consequences far more strategic than the Italian campaign could ever produce. German generals studying the Salerno operation recognized patterns that troubled them profoundly. Allied forces had landed with overwhelming material support. Every soldier ashore had access to more artillery support, more air cover, more logistical backing than German equivalents could dream of. Allied planning had been meticulous, anticipating German responses and preparing countermeasures. Allied forces had shown ability to absorb initial setbacks. Several American units had been badly mauled in the first days at Salerno, but had reorganized and continued fighting effectively. Most ominously, American forces specifically had demonstrated improvement from their earlier performances in North Africa and Sicily. The U.S. Fifth Army landing at Salerno fought with greater competence than American forces had shown at Kasserine Pass just 8 months earlier. The learning curve was steep and accelerating. American units were incorporating lessons from each battle, were developing tactical proficiency through experience, were becoming the kind of professional force that German commanders had to respect as dangerous opponents rather than dismiss as inexperienced amateurs. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who had faced American forces in North Africa and who was now involved in defensive preparations in northern Italy, provided his own assessment of what Salerno represented strategically. Rommel argued that Italy could not be held south of the Po River Valley, that attempting to defend the peninsula's length would only result in German forces being ground down in attritional warfare, while Allied bombers used Italian bases to devastate German industry. Better, Rommel suggested, to withdraw to the Alps and defend the northern approaches to the Reich, rather than committing forces to defend Italian territory that served no German strategic purpose. The Rommel-Kesselring debate about Italian defensive strategy reflected broader questions about how Germany should conduct defensive warfare in the war's later stages. Kesselring advocated fighting for every kilometre, making Allies pay maximum price for territorial gains, using Italy's terrain to impose casualties that might affect Allied strategy. Rommel argued for economy of force, for defending only what was strategically necessary, for preserving German military strength rather than expending it in campaigns that could not achieve decisive results. Hitler sided with Kesselring, not because Kesselring's strategy was militarily superior, but because it aligned with Hitler's psychological and ideological commitments. Withdrawal was weakness, holding ground was strength, making enemies bleed was always valuable, regardless of whether it achieved strategic objectives. The decision condemned German forces in Italy to a grinding campaign that would last until May 1945, that would tie down over 20 divisions in a theatre that offered no strategic opportunities, that would consume forces while accomplishing nothing beyond delay. The Italian civilians caught between German occupation and Allied liberation suffered immensely from this decision. German defensive tactics included destroying infrastructure to slow Allied advance, flooding valleys, demolishing bridges, mining roads. German rear area security forces conducted reprisals against partisan activity with characteristic brutality. Allied bombing and artillery, while directed at German military targets, inevitably killed Italian civilians and destroyed Italian property. The Italian campaign became a humanitarian catastrophe whose costs were borne primarily by people who had not wanted the war and whose supposed liberation often meant seeing their communities destroyed in the fighting. For the German generals who learned in September 1943 that Americans were landing at Salerno, the moment represented a recognition that Germany's southern strategic position had become untenable. Italy as an ally was gone. The armistice had ended that fiction permanently. Italy as occupied territory required defending, but that defense would consume resources without offering prospects for victory. The Americans and British would advance northward methodically, would eventually reach the Alps, would use Italian territory as a base for operations that threatened German interests throughout southern Europe. The reports from Salerno documented in tactical detail what was obvious at strategic level. Allied forces possessed overwhelming material advantages that German tactical skill could contest but not overcome. American soldiers were learning to fight effectively, were being led by commanders who showed operational competence, were supported by logistics that functioned with industrial efficiency. The Wehrmacht could make them pay for every kilometre of Italian territory, could slow their advance to a crawl in the mountains, could demonstrate tactical excellence in countless small engagements. But the outcome was never in doubt. Allied forces would advance, German forces would retreat, and the direction of movement was always northward toward Germany itself. General Jodl, reading the reports from Salerno and calculating their implications for Germany's overall strategic position, understood that the Italian campaign represented a slow-motion catastrophe that would unfold over years. Not catastrophic in the sense of sudden collapse, German forces would fight skillfully and would avoid the kind of decisive defeats that destroyed entire armies, but catastrophic in the strategic sense of committing forces to a campaign that served no purpose beyond postponing the inevitable, that consumed divisions needed elsewhere, that represented defensive warfare at its most futile, fighting competently to delay defeat without any prospect of preventing it. When German generals learned that Americans were landing in Italy, they were learning not just about one more amphibious operation, but about the shape of the war's remainder. They would fight defensive campaigns on multiple fronts, would demonstrate tactical excellence in losing battles, would watch as Allied material superiority was systematically applied to compress the Reich's defensive perimeter. Italy was where this pattern became undeniable, where even commanders who had believed in German victory had to acknowledge that the arithmetic of modern industrial warfare favored the Allies so completely that German forces could only fight to determine how long defeat would take, not whether defeat would come. The morning reports from Salerno, documenting American troops establishing beachheads under German fire, were also documenting the future, a future of defensive warfare, tactical competence without strategic hope, and the slow, grinding advance of enemies who possessed resources Germany could not match, and determination German forces could not break. The Italian campaign that began at Salerno in September 1943 would continue until Germany's surrender in May 1945, consuming forces and accomplishing nothing except to prove what the generals already knew, that the war was lost and that only the details of the losing remained to be determined.